My name is Elena Sokova. I'm the Executive Director of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. And it's my greatest pleasure to welcome all of you to our webinar today, focused on the book written by Trevor Findlay. And Trevor is a good friend and colleague for a number of years now. He started his career as an Australian diplomat, but then worked in non-governmental organizations and academia for a large part of his career. And that spans Australia, United States, Canada, UK and others, Sweden, as far as I understand. So many different organizations that, including the Managing the Atom at Harvard University, the Vertic, and many others. So it will take a long time to list all of your credentials, Trevor, but one of the biggest kind of credentials maybe that you probably don't know, but I would like you to know, is that when our new interns arrive at the center or somebody join us and they're interested in the International Atomic Energy Agency, the first books I gave them to read are the ones written by you. The famous UN nuclear watchdog that we had a pleasure hosting you here in Vienna with a very large crowd when that report came out, and many others. You could use your coverage of the work of the agency spans many issues, from the nuclear security to the financial issues at the agency, its budget, and nuclear safeguards, of course. So I was really looking forward to your new book, which I think was a product of several years' work at least. And I know you had a little bit of a preview during the IAEA Safeguard Symposium a few months ago. But it's such a wealth of information about the work of the agency, some of the past, and how various factors, but also cultural dimensions affected and organizational affected the work of the agency, and what we could learn from that experience going forward and improve its mission. So greatest pleasure. I wish we hosted you again in person. But maybe your next book. But in the meantime, such a great pleasure to have you, and I'll pass the microphone to you right away to provide us with the summary of your research, some of the findings, and then we will open the microphone for Q&As. Those of us who are following us on Zoom, please use the Q&A function to submit your questions. And those who are watching us on YouTube, feel free to send your questions or comments through email at events@vcdnp.org. With that, Trevor, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Elena, very much. And it's a shame I can't be there in person in Vienna, a city I'm very fond of. But in any case, it's a great pleasure to be with you and the audience to present the findings of my book. So let me just share the screen with you. Very good. Okay. And you'll notice at the bottom of my screen, I acknowledge the university is situated on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And the university encourages us to pay our respects to the elders of the original inhabitants of Australia, both past and present. And I point this out not just because it's something I want to do, but because it illustrates cultural change. Australia has come a long way since the time when we really didn't pay much attention to our First Nations people, to now acknowledging that they were here before colonization. So nations can change their culture just as organizations can change their culture. So let me dive straight into the question at issue. And like all good books, my book starts with a mystery. And the mystery is, why was it that Iraq declared certain facilities prior to 1991? And in actual fact, it had a much larger nuclear weapons establishment. These charts were provided by Laura Rockwood and Jacques Bault. So they are, I think, well informed. And you can just see the difference there between what Iraq declared in terms of its nuclear activities and what it actually had. So the question that my book addresses is, how did this come about? How did the IAEA and indeed the international community as a whole miss this growth of an Iraqi nuclear establishment when Iraq had a safeguards agreement with the IAEA? It was a party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. How did we miss this? So my book essentially tries to answer that question. And I drew on some analytical lenses, as they're called. And these, I didn't make these up. These are actually from John Carroll at MIT, an organizational theorist. And he says that one can look at international organizations through three different lenses. And they're not mutually exclusive, but each tells a different story and each provides a different lens to look at an international organization. So one is clearly politics. You hear this from journalists, people who work for the agency, diplomats saying, oh, it's political, everything's political. And that action in the political sphere comes through jockeying for power and negotiations. So that's the way business is done. Secondly, there's the institutional view of things. And in this case, it's organizations are a kind of machine that could be rationally designed for optimal performance. That's a very institutional attitude. And that action in this case comes through planning and management. And you hear this, of course, from management consultants. Oh, if only we could restructure the organization, then everything would be effective. And then there's the cultural lens. And I like to think of this very simply as the way we do things around here, regardless of whether that's the way we're supposed to do things, it's the way we do things around here. And so action comes, in this case, through habit and routine. And often this is unconscious, not spelled out. So applying these three lenses to the IAEA, clearly the IAEA was established and governed and is governed by sovereign states, is largely funded by states. States negotiate the safeguards agreements with the IAEA based on models and principles that the states themselves have agreed to. And I think it's fair to say that over the years, the states have more or less said, well, we don't want safeguards to be too intrusive. We're certainly not going to pay for the maximal in terms of verification, and we don't want them to be too onerous, and we don't want to impinge too much on our sovereignty. These are all political questions. The agency is governed by a board of governors, and as we've heard over the decades, this has become increasingly political, although in my view it was always political. The spirit of Vienna was supposed to initially guide the IAEA, but nonetheless, it was always political in the sense it represented governments. And the Board of Governors, of course, decides on non-compliance cases, which may or may not be reported to the UN Security Council. What about institutional explanations for the IAEA? Well, there is a view that the IAEA is a typical UN organization. That is, it's bureaucratic, it's inflexible, it's not very efficient. But when you look at the agency, it is ranked consistently amongst the most efficient and effective of UN organizations, particularly by US bodies that are congressionally mandated to look into these questions. So from a point of view of an institutional explanation, I don't think you could say that the IAEA was a failure. In fact, in my view, it is one of the most effective. And moreover, the Secretariat has a certain autonomy. And there is this theory in international relations about principals and agents. So in this case, the principals are the states and the agent is the IAEA. And this theory says that over time, the agent becomes much more knowledgeable than most of the principals and has more expertise and, in a sense, more power than the principals. And if you think of the huge number of member states of the IAEA, most of them are unable to follow the day-to-day workings of the agency. Look at all the budgetary documents, everything that the agency is doing. And so you end up with an agency that certainly has agency, to coin a phrase, and that the principals in some cases get left behind. So this, to my mind, is a powerful argument for saying that, yes, the Secretariat is effective. It does take its responsibilities passed to it by member states seriously. But then, of course, there's the classic dilemma of international organizations, this autonomy versus deference. So clearly, an organization like the IAEA can't run away with itself entirely. It has to have due deference to states because they pay the bills, basically. And there's a nice little quote at the bottom: you can bite the hand that feeds you, but you can't bite it off. So there's this constant tension between the member states seeking to preserve their sovereignty and their rights versus the international organization seeking autonomy. So this may in some way explain the Iraq case. All these explanations, by the way, are mutually exclusive, as I said, so they should just be treated as ways of looking at the problem. I zero in my book somewhat on the inspectors because they're the pointy end of safeguards. And so the question arises, were they responsible for the failure to detect Iraq? And here, clearly in the early days, safeguards were amateurish. Some of the early safeguards people tell us that. The inspectors were poorly recruited. They were not trained very well, and they were not very well debriefed when they came back from their inspections. But by the time the Iraq case came along in the 1980s, they were much improved. In fact, there were improvements in train as the Iraq case broke. And as far as I can tell, safeguards were applied to Iraq as required. There was no evidence that Iraq was diverting from its declared program. What it was doing was building a parallel program. The inspectors, as far as I can see, did what they were trained to do. They looked at the declarations provided by Iraq and they sought to verify that those declarations were correct. And I didn't see any evidence they were soft on Iraq, which some critics did allege at the time. So overall, I don't think this is a problem of the inspectors not being effective. But what I'll come to now is the question of culture. And that affects not just the inspectors, of course, but the whole organization, including the safeguards department as a whole. But a little diversion first, what is organizational culture? And for many people, it's quite mysterious. Partly because it seems so amorphous. It involves often unconscious values, norms, and perceptions, things that people don't often talk about, and they just adopt through habit. And the thing about culture is that if you don't fit in with the culture of the organization you join, you either try and change it, which can make you very unpopular, or you leave. So over time, there's this self-reinforcing nature of culture, and organizations over time develop quite strong cultures that are difficult then to change. The culture in an organization affects not just individual, but collective behavior. So it can be deeply ingrained in individuals as well as the way the organization itself acts. And sometimes trying to investigate this is like psychoanalysis. You're really trying to probe what people's real understanding is of their job and the motives they have behind it. And dysfunctional culture may cause organizational failure. So in that case, the culture is not well matched to the aims of the organization. That's when failure occurs. Culture is very hard to change, as I say, because it's embedded in everyone's thinking. But often it's easiest to change after a crisis. So that a crisis occurs in the organization, it realizes that something is wrong. And we see this time and again where organizations fail. There was a question about the culture at Uber, for instance, a question about the secret service culture. all organizations have culture whether they like it or not. And often when there is a crisis, failures, then culture helps tell the story of why that happened. On the other hand, if you try and force change in a culture, you may have unintended consequences. So you need to be quite careful about trying to change the culture deliberately, because that can backfire. The leadership of the organization is key here, and the incentives that you provide. So you want not only a leadership that is aware of the cultural implications of what it does and says, but also provides the right incentives. If the incentives are wrong for individuals, then it's very difficult to change the culture. So organizational culture is, I think, more easily defined if you have the structure to do it. Otherwise, it's just this quite amorphous concept. And the way Edgar Schein does it, so he's the guru of organizational culture, is to divide it into three areas: artifacts, espoused values, and basic underlying assumptions. So the artifacts are things in the IAEA case, like the MPT, the Safeguards Agreement, the uniforms that the agency personnel wear, the equipment they take on inspections, all things that signal some sort of value. The espoused values, they're the strategies, goals, and philosophies. So things like the IAEA slogan, Atoms for Peace and Development, that is an espoused value straight away there. But also things like strategic plans and specific documents. Then, and this is the hardest thing of all to determine, the basic underlying assumptions. And because these are often conscious, they're unconscious, they're taken for granted, that's the hardest thing to evaluate of all. And what you want really is for these three areas to be in line. If one is not in line, then this causes problems in the culture. So let me turn to one of the basic artifacts of Safeguards culture. And this gets to the question really of declared versus undeclared materials, which was really at the heart of the Iraqi controversy. And the principal artifact here is the Safeguards Agreement, Insert 153, Rev 2. And if you read this, it seems to suggest that, and this was the intention of the negotiators, that the agency should be concerned with all source or special fissionable material in all peaceful nuclear activities within the territory, in this case of Iraq, under its jurisdiction or control. So there doesn't seem to be any doubt here that what the agency is concerned with is both declared and undeclared materials and activities and facilities. But of course, the Iraq case revealed that, in fact, that wasn't the case. The agency was mostly, almost exclusively, concerned with what Iraq had declared and missed the undeclared. So I refer to this as cultural drift, because clearly the foundation documents say something different to what actually happened. And these are rather detailed, I know, these three quotes, but these are three of the quotes I got from people who really should know the way safeguards work and could explain to me why there was this difference between what was in the Safeguards Agreement and what actually happened. And my favorite is by Roger Housley, who visited the agency with his boss from British Nuclear Fuels at one stage, and he asked him about safeguards and said, well, I don't really understand why is safeguards limited to verification of declared material, because who would divert declared material? And this is a lovely quote. With a slight air of superiority, his boss sort of tapped me on the head and said, well, eventually you'll get to understand what this is all about. So that's culture. That's a cultural signifier right there. You know, the way we do things around here. So don't worry about what you think is in the statute or in the Safeguards Agreement or in the protocols and documents. This is the way we do it. And then we have Myron Kratzer and Richard Cooper, who were seminal in producing the safeguards system. And they were asked in a whole series of interviews and discussions by the Pacific Northwest Nuclear Laboratory about how this had happened. And it's clear from their quotes that neither can really explain how this cultural drift happened. How did we get from the necessity to include declared and undeclared materials to a situation where the Iraq case was missed? And Rich Hooper says there is no answer. It just is that way. So that's culture. That's the way we do things around here. And Myron Kratzer says, it's to me the mystery of safeguards. Again, something ineffable, something that you can't quite pin down. So how could this happen? So I've been thinking through, and it's all in my book there, about how could this cultural drift happen? And I think there are lots of factors here. It's almost overdetermined. So clearly, safeguards in the early days, at least, was seen as a gentleman's agreement. We'll get you to commit to these safeguards, but we won't actually verify them too intensively and too expensively. We'll treat these like confidence building measures. There's a question of complacency. So up until Iraq, there was no previous case of undeclared activities. So that should be an of, not an if, undeclared activities. So it's a natural human tendency to think, well, the system is working, so why should we rock the boat? Also, I think it's true, and John Carlson's pointed this out to me, that it was challenging enough at the beginning just to verify declared materials. That was quite a revolution in international affairs for inspectors to be going into states and verifying things on the spot, particularly in a sensitive area like nuclear. So that was quite the task for the agency, and it was natural that over time this became the focus, because why would you then put effort into thinking about things that have on some occasions be called unknown unknowns? There's also a human tendency to focus on what we can see and count. Inspectors certainly, as often engineers or scientists, like that. That's part of their culture. This is what we can measure. This is what we can see and count, rather than speculating about what there might be. I think, and no one else really has pointed this out, there's a question of the English language here. So diversion, the word diversion is used a lot in safeguards, and diversion really in English means moving one thing from one place to another, or misusing it from one original place to another. Whereas Iraq didn't really divert, it created a whole parallel nuclear enterprise. It wasn't diverting so much. So the language of safeguards is permeated by this concept, which really doesn't apply to every case. Now, I don't know if that applies in other languages, but certainly English, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. The difficulty of proving a negative, that's another problem with looking for undeclared. You're trying to prove that something doesn't exist, and that is a classic verification problem. There's really no answer to that, but in a sense, you try and get to as close 100% as possible, but of course, that's not possible. Clearly, and this is related to the politics, of course, states were unwilling to allow the agency to go on fishing expeditions. This was Hans Blix's explanation, or provide intelligence. And of course, that must be part also of the explanation, one of the lenses that we look at this problem through. So over time, the inspections became routinized, and human beings like routine, right? So this cultural drift fed into the way inspectors did their work. And finally, one aspect is what's called cognitive dissonance. So you're ignoring signs that don't actually fit in with what you're expected to see. And there's a famous experiment where there are basketball teams playing match, and the audience is instructed to simply follow the ball and really concentrate, focus on the ball. At one stage, a man in a gorilla suit runs across the court. And later on, most of the people in the experiment do not remember seeing a man in a gorilla suit running across the court. So because they didn't expect a man in a gorilla suit to run across the court. That's one of the most famous experiments in this area. So again, ignoring things that don't quite fit in with what you're expecting. So let me talk a bit about cultural change now and how the agency, I think, has moved on from Iraq. And through the book, I've got these charts which show the pre-1991 situation and what I think has happened now. And in the artifacts, it's very obvious, and I think all for the best. And the bottom right-hand box there, I think, says it all. You have the state level concept, you have state evaluation groups, you have integrated safeguards, and the use of all these additional sources of information. So that those artifacts signal a definite cultural change compared to what we had before, when open source information was not openly allowed and intelligence information was not provided. So the artifacts are now suggesting, of course, that you do worry about undeclared materials and activities. So here are these espoused values. These are the things that the agency says it does. And for some, there's no change. So the pre-1991 emphasis on safeguards being non-discriminatory, technically based, effective. There's no change there. But there has been change, of course, in the way acquisition paths are considered. There are more acquisition paths. That is now a vital part of the way safeguards analysis is carried out. The emphasis on correctness and completeness, that is new, and that is now like a new mantra of the agency. And you just see it everywhere. You see it in the Iran documents, for instance, where the agency reports on Iran's compliance with the JCPOA, for instance. So this, in espoused values, is a turnaround. Of the way inspectors are trained, inspectors are meant to be more inquisitive, investigatory, innovative, and I've seen some of the training courses and materials, and that's clearly now embedded in the espoused values. And then the broader conclusion that really does wrap up this whole business about declared and undeclared materials. And you see that in the way the agency now categorizes states in the safeguards report, the annual safeguards report. So it seems to me that in terms of the espoused values, the things the agency says it does, then there's been significant change. Now let me come to the underlying assumptions, and this is much more difficult to detect. From everything I see, and when I've talked to people in the safeguards department, it seems that there are now changed underlying assumptions. So people do now generally assume that correctness and completeness is vital. There doesn't seem to be any doubt about that. There is obviously an assumption that there'll be closer collaboration between inspectors, analysts, planners. There was initially some resistance to this, of course, because inspectors used to be, they used to rule the roost. They were the most important people at the agency. And so you had a whole new subculture of analysts and planners joining the safeguards enterprise, and the need for collaboration. And while resistance wouldn't be openly spoken about, in the early days, there clearly was some resistance to this idea that the inspectors now had to collaborate with everyone very closely. I don't detect any of that residual resentment there, but it's not absolutely clear, and we don't actually know. Then, of course, the safeguards training should have embedded these underlying assumptions in people's thinking, the resourcefulness, the initiative, that will be rewarded. So in a sense, the rewards should match the way the agency says it does its work. And the culture is, in some senses, although they don't use the word culture necessarily, now embedded in the recruitment and training. And so you can see that those underlying assumptions are at least intended to be absorbed there. The reason I'm being tentative about this is because we don't actually know whether these underlying assumptions are there unless there is this proper scientific study done on this. So that involves questionnaires of agency personnel, involves interviewing them and having them talk about what they assume to be their job and how they view it. These are the things that are difficult to analyze, and you can analyze the artifacts, you can analyze the documents and the procedures, but this is a much trickier case. So what are some of the continuing questions? And because this is not a closed book, obviously, culture is constant, it moves, changes, it can deteriorate, it can improve. So my book isn't the final word, unfortunately. because there hasn't been this scientific survey of agency staff, I'm left not knowing entirely whether the culture is embedded there. This could only be done by an external authority who would be able to help the agency do this. It can't really be done internally because whoever's in the agency internally is also part of the culture. That is the paradox here. And simply having someone in the agency do this would not be as revealing as having an outsider do it. Second question is, how well is the culture performing vis-a-vis Iran, which is obviously a case that is actively considered by the agency at the moment. And my assumption is that the culture is currently holding up well in the Iran case, simply because of the completeness, correctness and completeness question. You see that in the Iran documents issued by the agency. And it's pretty clear now that if the agency doesn't concern itself with correctness and completeness, that can undermine the safeguard system, because now it's such a part of the way we think about safeguards. There are some new major tests. One is Ukraine, of course. How does the agency insist that safeguards are still implemented despite the situation in Ukraine? That is a very difficult situation for the agency, and again goes to the question of the strength of the agency's culture and asserting its rights and responsibilities in a situation like that. The AUKUS submarines, of course. So any change to safeguards, the way they are applied, does imply implications for the culture itself. So to what extent will the agency's culture now permit that new approach to safeguards to be implemented, and will that sit well with the way that the culture has evolved since Iraq? One of the questions I have, will the IAEA adopt a deliberate cultural approach? And it seems to me the new Director General is very open to this. It doesn't necessarily mean using the word culture, but it certainly means having an awareness that leadership is extremely important in determining culture, that incentives are important, and there should be a match between what the agency says is its role and the way that its staff are trained and encouraged and incentivized to carry out their function. So there needs to be collaboration here, obviously, between the highest levels and the lowest levels. Member states are also not off the hook. I don't really talk about that much in my book because there has been work done on national safeguards culture, but clearly every member state has its own national safeguards culture. Some are much better than others. Some are transparent, and some states go out of their way to be helpful to the IAEA. But it seems to me it's increasingly important that all states in their own national safeguards establishment and in their culture have a culture that aligns with that of the agency. We could say that in the case of Iraq and North Korea, they had a safeguards culture too, but it wasn't designed to be collaborative. It was designed actually to hide their transgressions against safeguards. So that's the thing to bear in mind, that all organizations and states have cultures. It's just whether they're appropriate ones for what we expect the outcomes to be. So states can improve their own national safeguards culture by working with the agency. It's the agency which often sets the tone for safeguards culture rather than the other way around. So in that case, they need to learn from the agency's own culture and also ask themselves how their own culture promotes better safeguards rather than looking at it from their own national interest point of view. It takes an internationalist approach, in other words. And finally, one of the most interesting things is that, as I mentioned, the organizational culture changes whether you like it or not. And one way it changes is when you change the workforce. So if you have mass retirements of personnel, that brings a whole new lot of people into the workforce. If you aim for gender parity, which the Director General, I think quite laudably is doing that, that too will change the culture. I don't know how it will change the culture, but Director General Grossi has said that, and by the way, women make the best inspectors. So that in itself will change the culture. The drive to recruit more personnel from developing countries will also change the culture. So you can see that this is quite a task for the agency. It's a multinational organization which has lots of individual cultures amongst its employees. It has different cultures within different departments and even subcultures of the inspector culture, the analyst culture. It's quite a job to bear all these moving parts in mind when you're trying to run an international organization like the IAEA. And finally, I'll leave you with a great quote from Peter Drucker, who is one of the gurus of management theory: "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." And I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Great, that is fascinating, Trevor. We do have questions that already came in, but before I pass them on to you, wanted to ask, you spent quite a bit of time in your book talking about the safeguard culture as a phenomenon and as a term, and also comparing with nuclear safety and nuclear security culture, which are much more defined. And maybe you could say a few words about that comparison and why we have a more defined safety and security culture, but not much of the safeguards. Yours is one of the first kind of attempt to look at it.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I puzzled over this for a long time. I think it's partly because safety and security culture is easier to sell to the individual. The individual, if someone's working a nuclear power plant or an inspector visiting a dangerous location, they have a personal vested interest in making sure that safety and security are taken care of. You don't really need much convincing of the individual. They're incentivized already to worry about those things. In the case of safeguards, it's a long line from finding perhaps something undeclared or a flaw in a declaration to some sort of threat to an IAEA safeguards inspector. You know, if there's an undeclared nuclear weapons program, the threat to the inspector individually is going to take a long time to reach fruition. So I think that's part of it. You know, industrial organizations often have a sign out saying, you know, 50 accident-free days. That's a safety and a security issue, but it's hard to match that with safeguards. So I think the way you incentivize people in the safeguards culture area is very, very different because it doesn't have that visceral connection to the individual. What it does have, and I think the agency has done this pretty well, is to embed in its employees this idea that you're working for international peace and security. That to me is vital. And when you interview people from the agency, they often frame their work in that context. The problem is that's also a bit of a long shot. So safeguards is a long way from preventing nuclear war in a way. It's a very important activity in that sequence of events, but again, it's a long shot. So the agency has its work cut out for it to convince individuals that this really is a contribution to international peace and security. So the way it defines safeguards culture will have to take that into account. But this is what you're doing. You're not just going on an on-site inspection and worrying about a declaration. You're actually making this contribution. And I think the way inspectors and others are rewarded, the way the Director General and others talk about the work of the inspectors, which can often be dangerous anyway to them personally, I think are key to this.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. It's very interesting to see how these different aspects of nuclear culture, so to speak, nuclear governance cultures interact or intersect and develop. There are a couple of questions related to the role of the member states, and I'll hold on them for now. But Now, very good questions from Nina Tannenwald, who's actually now in Vienna for 6 months. And she asks, like, well, when, excellent also example about the gorilla running through the field. So she's asking whether you can identify the first moment or case historically when inspectors made a decision to ignore the gorilla during the inspection, if there are any of those, and whether there are any early on or subsequent gorillas and ignored, and where they made the decision that they were not supposed to investigate it, and whether there were any kind of legal specialists involved in that decision.
Well, on the first one, there is a report that in Iraq, some of the illicit activities were taking place in a building or buildings where there were also declared activities. And so that will be a case of where the inspectors had access to the building, but didn't necessarily ask, well, what was happening in the rest of the other part of the building. So that's just anecdotal, and I'm not sure anyone wrote that down anywhere in inspection reports, but that's the sort of thing that if you're training inspectors to be more curious and investigative, that would sort of ring alarm bells. Okay, there's this huge building, but only part of it's been declared, and why are we not allowed access to that other part of the building? There are other instances in Iraq apparently where suddenly there were no personnel to be seen. So someone had decided that the personnel should not be there while the inspection was taking place. And that, I mean, in retrospect, these can be seen as red flags, but if you don't have that mindset, which hopefully now inspectors do, then you wouldn't be necessarily questioning that. You wouldn't be looking for that. So I think that's part of the problem. So the agency wasn't really looking in Iraq for things over the berm, for instance, as they say, over these large sand berms. And if they did, they wouldn't necessarily be thinking, well, that's connected to the nuclear enterprise. So, yeah, I think specific instances are very hard to pin down because they weren't really recorded. But that's the sort of thing that I've been talking about. And then whether there were any legal decisions made, I don't know. It's very hard to peer into the legal department. Perhaps Laura Rockwood could provide more instance on that. But I know that Laura did have debates within the legal department of the agency about just the meaning of INSIRC 153, and didn't it really mean all nuclear material? So I think that was a legal discussion that was going on within the Safeguards Department at the time. So obviously a general one, not specifically related to an incident, but still, that I think that was also happening within the agency.
Yeah, thank you, Trevor. But continue with another Nina question from Nina.
Good question.
Great questions. After the Iraq case, did the push to change organizational culture and the way things done came from the agency itself or from states? And how would you evaluate the push for change? Who did it mainly come from?
That's a great question, Nina. I think because people in this field don't use the language of culture, it was often very hard to figure this out. I don't think many states talked about changing the culture, but what they did do, of course, was change things like the additional protocol and the strengthened safeguard system. I think it was within the agency itself, within the secretariat, within the Safeguards Department, the planning people who, without using the word, realized that these new instruments they had would inevitably need a new culture, for instance, in training inspectors, and in the way that you needed now collaboration between a whole new set of personnel, the analysts and the inspectors. So all credit due to the IAEA Secretariat for thinking through the implications of these new artifacts and documents that have been approved by states, but then, of course, had to be implemented. And actually, you can see that all the way through the history of the agency. And it makes sense that the states, they negotiate these agreements, then they hand them over to the Secretariat to implement, which is the proper role of the Secretariat. And so then for the Secretariat to figure out how on earth we do this, and that applies to the very earliest days of safeguards through to the additional protocol. And part of that is what mindset do we bring to this? How do we interpret the technical aspects of these documents in terms of what human beings do at the workplace and how they think about their work? And I think increasingly it's the Safeguards Department itself which is driving this thinking about culture, even if they don't use the word.
Okay. Tied to that question, but more to the modern than current situation and nowadays. We don't know the author, but the question is for you, Trevor, whether you interviewed the diplomatic community for your book, but also do you get the sense that member states are interested or motivated to promote an effective culture at the IAEA? Did you find that member states tend to focus on their own parochial interest as a higher priority than the effectiveness of the IAEA? And what do you think could be done to improve the relationship between the Secretariat and the member states?
Wow, there's a lot there to chew
I know,
on.
it's a big question.
Yes, I did talk to a lot of diplomats, and I was a diplomat, so I feel very comfortable with that. And often it was just off the record, but clearly a lot of them were puzzled by what this culture business was. I think many states are interested in supporting the IAEA and are interested in improving safeguards. It's just that they don't look at it through a cultural lens. And this also applies to many of the technical people in the agency too, that they didn't seem to understand what culture was. And over the years, there have been a few workshops held in various locales, including INMM and SADA, and even at the agency itself, where in theory, the topic was safeguards culture, but everyone went on to talk about the techniques and technologies. So clearly the diplomatic culture and the engineering culture do not easily think about anthropological questions or sociological questions. Like it's a different field. And I'm a political scientist, and I had trouble writing the book about a subject which seemed to me very amorphous, valuable, but to get a grip on it is quite difficult. So I quite understand why member states don't focus on this. Goodness knows there's enough other things to focus on in safeguards, and this just doesn't seem so important. But I think organisationally it's fundamental, and unless you get the culture right, then you're not going to have a very effective organisation. So it took a lot of talking to diplomats and people within the technical side of safeguards to convince them of the value of this. And even then, some remain skeptical. So yeah, because it's a difficult question, it's hard to get states to motivate themselves to contribute to this debate. But I think if states allow the Secretariat to move on this question, then that can be very helpful, and it doesn't necessarily require the input of diplomats from the various missions. But what it does require is for states themselves to have a healthy safeguards culture nationally in the SSAC and other aspects of their safeguards system.
Thank you, Trevor. There is somewhat related question, but it's more about the obligations that states take with respect to safeguards. And from Petra Sebert, how do you see from your framework the resistance to making the additional protocol universal? Is there a cultural rift between nations?
I hadn't really thought about it in that term. I think that would be more political from my point of view. and also institutional in that in the case of Argentina, Brazil, of course, they have an institution which does this bilaterally, these safeguards. So that's part of their argumentation about the additional protocol. But yes, I think that's more a political question than a cultural question. But if you're thinking about ways to make safeguards as effective as possible, and part of that is thinking about the agency's own culture, then clearly additional protocol is helpful to a robust IAEA culture. So by joining the additional protocol, you're contributing to that, the growth of that culture, which is emanated from the strengthened safeguard system and the additional protocol. But I think fundamentally it's a political question.
Okay, I would agree with you. It's less about the culture, but I don't know.
Could I just stress too that these three lenses that I've been looking at the Iraq question through, I think are equally valid. They just provide a different perspective. So in a way, it's not a question of either or. They just help you think differently about the same question.
Yeah, that is true. I don't know whether you know the Comprehensive Safeguard Agreement in CIRC 153 by heart, but there is a question coming from the Permanent Mission of Russia to comment. How would you comment on a statement that there is a certain balance between Article 2 and Article 27 of the Model Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement? I don't have the copy of the, if you don't remember it, just...
I don't either. But I presume it's a balance of rights and responsibilities, which is clearly important. That's the way the agreements were negotiated and framed. But I don't think that detracts any way from the idea that the agency should be concerned with declared and undeclared materials and activities. In fact, when that INFCIRC 153 was negotiated, South Africa, I believe, specifically proposed that safeguards only apply to declared material. And it was essentially laughed out of court. What would be the point? And so, yes, the negotiating record shows just how important that particular emphasis was on all source and fissionable material.
Thank you. There's a question from your colleague from the Asia Pacific Leadership Network, from John Dilliman. He's asking, it seems to me that major constraint on early safeguards was European as well as US and Canadian commercial sensitivities. It was very apparent even in the late 80s, but also a key element in the bilateral safeguards agreements negotiation that Australia undertook in the early 80s. This was reflected in Safeguards Department approaches, especially under certain DGGs products of national nuclear industries. Could you comment on that? That is actually a very interesting question, how the industries themselves affect both the safeguards implementations, the shaping of the concept, and the cultural impact as well.
Yeah, I think John's correct in that case, but in those cases, the industry views get fed in through government representatives, and then that is obviously represented in the negotiation strategy and position of member states. But that also feeds into the culture, this idea, and that came out in that quote from the head of BNFL, oh, you don't understand what safeguards are, really. We're not concerned with undeclared materials. This is the way things are. And that was from an industry person, BNFL. And obviously, they did not want safeguards to be too intrusive or too much of an impingement on commercial activities. So that's the way I see that. In the broader perspective, that does affect safeguards culture because it impinges on the ability of the agency to have effective verification. But I would see the commercial aspect as part of the general political and diplomatic push to rein in the intrusiveness of safeguards as those agreements were being negotiated. I wouldn't see that as a separate push, but it clearly fed into the government position.
Thank you, Trevor. And probably would be the last question as we are approaching the end of the webinar. But I want you to say to tell us a little bit more about your thinking regarding what, in your view, could be improved and with the current safeguards culture and the way they operate, and how the IAEA itself and member states could help with that. You started with some of this in your presentation, including probably a good assessment of the organizational culture from outside, but what else could be done, both by the Secretariat itself and the member states?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so one is clearly to find out what the current underlying culture is. That's really important. You shouldn't really do anything too drastic before you understand what people's thoughts are about the culture. Secondly, I would emphasize leadership. It has to come from the top, and there has to be consistency in the way the agency presents itself, both externally and internally, in terms of its mission. Training is vitally important. And here in training, you're dealing with lots of different national cultures. So the challenge really is to produce a culture within newcomers that fits with the culture that you want in the agency, not necessarily the existing one, but the one that you want in the future. And that can be quite a sensitive thing to be doing. In the training sense, I would actually encourage the agency to use the word culture, because I think that gets across the message that there is this phenomenon that we need to be aware of and train people to be conscious of. So much of this is about awareness and about understanding of exactly what culture is. Secondly, and I've seen improvements in this a lot already, the way that the Director General and others talk about safeguards inspectors. He very much lauded the teams that went into Ukraine. They weren't just safeguards inspectors, of course, but just giving them this credit for the work they are carrying out on behalf of the international community, which hasn't always been the case in the case of all DDGs or DGs. Often I got the impression the inspectors were somehow left to their own devices, as it were. But they are a vital part of what the agency does. And so there needs to be rewards, recognition, and an awareness of the incredible job they do. And I think the agency itself needs to continually bear that in mind. But also not just inspectors, but the other personnel within the Safeguards Department. I think, and it's easy for me to say, but to my mind, the Safeguards Department is the most important component of the agency, the most revolutionary in terms of being incredibly proud of. And I think through the history of the agency, that's not always been the case. That hasn't, that message that this is a really important role for the agency hasn't always been put front and center. And I think Director General Grossi is doing a good job in helping lift that aspect up in the agency. Recruitment is also important in terms of recruiting people who I think they should be assessed on the basis they're going to be able to adapt to the agency's culture as well. And that it's very important to recruit people very carefully.
I think these are excellent recommendations. I'm sure somebody's taking note of them. But I would also probably agree and kind of join in chiming in and saying that the agency and all member states should be, and the international community should be proud of the work that the safeguards do, the agency inspectors and overall safeguards analysts and community there. not only Ukraine we're looking now, but during COVID, when they had to continue to do inspections, despite of the interruption of travel and all these quarantine and everything else. So many kudos to the agency and its safeguards department, and wishing them all the best.
Yes.
With that,
in fact, one of the things with COVID was the resilience the agency demonstrated, and resilience is an important part of culture too. So that, I think, was a good omen, that they were able to be so resilient and so flexible and adaptable.
Yep, I agree, totally agree. With that, I think we ended and went a little bit, just a tiny bit over, but I wanted to all of you to join me thanking Trevor Findlay for an excellent work. It's valuable contribution to the field, to the world of nuclear governance, particularly safeguards, and for your time today and your excellent points and answers to the questions. And we'll be looking forward to your new work related to nuclear governance. With all the best, and thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, Elena. Thank you, everybody.